The Lives of Lucian Freud, Youth. Chapter 1. I love German poetry, but I loathed German language. With a doleful shake of the head, during a platform discussion with me at the 1995 Edinburgh Festival relating to a School of London exhibition, the critic David Sylvester declared Lucian Freud to be, in his view, not a born painter. Freud, he said, had applied himself to the art of painting without ever convincing me that he was a painter. 5 days later, in an article in The Guardian, written in response to a report of the discussion in the Times, he expanded on this notion of the inherent or incubated. Quote, in reality, he has become an outstanding painter without having been, I think, a painter by nature. He is a painter made, not born, made by a huge effort of will applied to the realization of a highly personal and searching vision of the world. End quote. Reading this, Freud laughed. He was a cliché rounding on cliché. Certainly he liked to think himself as self-made. Quote, I like the anarchic idea of coming from nowhere, but I think that's probably because I had a very steady childhood. End quote. Anyone with Sigmund Freud as a grandfather could be all too readily assumed to have a privileged access, by genetic imprint maybe, to a searching understanding of character and motivation, not to mention a predisposition to examine people on couches. The parallels are inviting: clinical analysis and portrait analysis, neurosis diagnosed and neurosis depicted. In reality, however, Lucian inherited only his grandfather's fur-colored overcoat and part share, with the other grandchildren in the copyrights on his published works. True, the illustrious surname awaited him at birth. That may have provoked expectations, but the idea of anyone being born or not born an artist, or indeed born a psychoanalyst was, he murmured, ridiculous. Quote, it's a jargon, a twerp's born, a born idiot. No, the only thing you can be born, actually, is a baby. Born in Berlin on 8th December 1922, the middle son of 30-year-old Ernst Ludwig Freud, youngest son of Sigmund Freud. Lucian Michael Freud was named after his mother, Lucy Brush, and Michael, the fighting archangel. His elder brother, Stephen Gabriel, had been born 16 months before, and the younger brother, Clemens Raphael, came 16 months later. The eighth, number 8, and the multiples of 8 were to become significant factors in gambling calculations throughout his life. As for the archangel names, Lucy Freud explained that they fitted in with her plan to have 3 children. She had been certain that she would have boys only. Lucian considered himself isolated, outstandingly so, from the start. My mother said that my first word was aliene, which means alone. Leave me alone. I always liked being on my own. I was always terribly anxious. There should be no competition. His mother, it emerged, had a special attitude to looks. I suppose he and she were familiarly referred to. He was the born favorite, She treated me in a way as an only child from very early on. It seemed unhealthy in a way. I always longed to have a sister. Ernest Freud maintained an architect's office in the large family apartment, tall, paneled rooms with chandeliers in Regent's Street, 23 in Lutzow, an imposing district of Berlin near the Tigerton, 2 streets away from where Mrs. van der Rohe's new National Gallery now stands. He had a partner and 2 assistants, Mr. Kurz and Mr. Augenfeld, who we called Grog, as he looked like a Grog, the clown who I had seen at the circus. Lucian considered his father good at jokes, but a bit distant. Quote, I thought the one time I liked my father was when he used to walk me with my feet on his feet, and he would open his mouth and be a giant and take huge steps. Quote, end quote. Professionally speaking, he was easygoing, so much so that he had to be bailed out on several occasions by his mother-in-law or cousins. The Moses, when business ventures failed. He was happy, eager even, to represent the great Viennese Professor Freud at receptions in his honor. My mother wasn't. She felt it was wrong to be put in the position of going somewhere for his father rather than himself. My father's favorite musical instrument was the one-man band, bag, drum, and trumpet. Grandfather, too, prided himself on being unmusical. In Vienna, you have to have an attitude. He was the sort of architect who had drawn houses that weren't built. Richard Neutra was an old friend of his from Vienna, and Gropius he admired and knew a little, but he was obviously not at the forefront. He did things very quietly, and even though the style was quite radical, he was not an innovator of the style. He was a user of the style. His building included a small cigarette factory, the new villa in Dahlem for Sigmund Freud's friend Dr. Hans Lampo, and a house overlooking a lake in Gotto near Potsdam for Dr. Frank, director of the Berlin Discount Gesellschaft, a novel feature of which was a window described in the studio year book, Decorative Art 1934, as a glass wall 20 feet long, sliding down into the cellar, worked by Weiss and easily manipulated by hand. He fitted up consulting rooms for psychoanalysts, couches calculatedly placed just in relation to the analyst chair, and designed furniture, heavy shelving in African rosewood for his own study, and sofas that Lucian remembered as being most inventive in ashwood and very severe. In a Berlin of a grand turn-of-the-century apartment blocks, the interiors that Ernst Freud produced were clear-cut expressions of modernity installed behind ponderous facades. Frank Auerbach, who many years later was to become Freud's closest painter friend and whose father was a lawyer, remembered the type of apartment that he and Lucian grew up in as being stiflingly well appointed. Quote, the apartment, I don't know what you would call it, a sort of hexagonal hole with doors leading off it in various directions, my father's office being one of the doors leading off. These flights were big, and there were courtyards where people would beat carpets in the center of the court. Ours was a Wilmerdorf flat. Tiger Garden was a park lane. Evidently, the Freuds, thanks to Brush family money, were one step up from the Auerbachers. In April 1922, Sigmund Freud wrote to Ernst for his 30th birthday. You possess everything a man can want at your age: a loving wife, a splendid child, work, and friends. This was more than the usual good wishes. Earlier that year, there had been, as Hans Lampo put it, a brief period of alienation in his youngest son's marriage, about which he knew next to nothing, for disturbing news was generally kept from the professor. However, according to his daughter Anna, a not altogether reliable source, he blamed his daughter-in-law for whatever upset or estrangement there may have been, and lamented how few women know how to love their man. Admira, sarcastically referred to by Ernst Freud as Schwabisch Nachtigall, means the Swabian nightingale, was said to have addressed poems to her. 70 years later, Lucian Freud confirmed this. Quote, he wrote these poems to my mother, sonnets, but I don't think she would have given my father any cause. She could never have had anything to hide. It wasn't her way. End quote. As it was, the couple were reconciled. Lucian was born, and the marriage thrived. I'm sure they were happily married, as they would go abroad on their own to Italy or Spain or Greece. In later life, both brothers, Clement and Stephen as they became known, took to letting it be known confidentially that their mother having died meanwhile, the time had come to disclose that the Swabian nightingale, Ernst Halbern, was quite possibly Lucian's father. Setting aside the entertaining thought that if he didn't happen to be descended from Sigmund, then he could be relieved of the irritation of it being so often said that he had inherited the genes of psychoanalytical acumen. Lucian dismissed the guess as a brotherly slur. Quote, my grandparents adored my mother. Both loved her and were terribly pleased that my father, gentle, quiet, had married such a talented and good woman. In some ways, considering what you read about Berlin then, they led a short, sheltered life. End quote. While Ernst Freud was known for easy-going optimism, though subject to migraines, Lucy Freud was admired for her seriousness, her beauty, and vivacity, and moreover for being a good housewife. Quote, my mother's classical scholarship, University of Munich, came in useful once, when they were on a boat and there was a priest on it, and the only language they had in common was Latin. Ernst being Austrian, the Berlin police picked him up once in the 20s as a suspect foreigner, lived by Viennese conventionality. Quote, we had a lunch on Sundays with our parents. Father required 2 vegetables for a main dish, and he made a coffee after the meal as men did that in Vienna. It was one of the links between Turkey and Vienna. The famous coach was Turkish. End quote. Home life was compartmented and secluded. First a nanny, then a governess had charge of the boys. The barber came to the house, and the dentist. Round the corner in Bandigestrasse, now Strafferberger Strasse, were the Moses cousins. Dr. Mose, his wife Gerda, Lucy's sister, and their children, Joe, who was a couple of years older than Lucian, Richard and Wolf, a year younger, and Corolla. The Moses wealth derived from newspaper publishing, as stated that of the Ulistens, who lived next door to the Freuds. Gabrielle Uisten, a few months older than Lucian, was the granddaughter of Louis Uisten, publisher of the Berliner Morgenpost and the Berliner Illustrator Zeitung, whose Ulisten printing house on Ulenstenstrasse was one of the finest modern industrial buildings in Berlin. Looking back, Gabrielle suspected her mother rather kept her distance from Lucy Freud, uncomfortable with having so good-looking a neighbor. Arrangements, however, were made for the Freud boys to join Gabrielle and the others in an impoverished kindergarten with use of the Usten stampede. Every afternoon, Gabrielle Usten remembered, nannies gathered in a tiger tent with their charges and settled into cliques. Children with misses looking after them were halved off from those with mademoiselles or with Fräuleins. Superior Bruce had English nannies and governesses. Gabrielle had a Rose from Ipswich, then a Miss Penfold, then a Miss Parfit, while the Freud had a Bavarian to look after them. Lucian did not take to her. Fräulein per Lindemeyer, we called her Lindy. I remember thinking there was something wrong about my mother coming up to the bedroom to get an affectionate goodnight one just before I had been beaten by Lind the governess. Just bashes with her huge arm. Lindy's recollection of Lucian, decades later, he reported, was that he was very lively but not affectionate. When we went to Bavaria to stay in a chalet that the Ullensteins had on the way down on the train to Munich in a sleeping car, she fell out of the hammock. The Bavarian chalet had a balcony around it where every afternoon the children were made to sit on their potties. Silent concentration was the rule until one day, according to Gabrielle, Lucian decided to play up, jerking himself along the landing on his potty like an eager jockey. He was, Gabrielle felt, a born instigator. Lucian had the authority of expecting to be obeyed. His memory of this went further. I remember feeling very merry on the upstairs landing and wanting to go out looking for mushrooms and wild strawberries. Let loose, they splashed around in a stream and competed to see who could get the most leeches on their legs. Told it his first school to tie shoelaces in a particular way, he promised himself, I will never tie them that way again. Misbehavior always stimulated him. We were walking with our nannies in the Tiergarten with Michael and Paul, the sons of our doctor, Professor Dr. Hamburger. There were beggars around. There were lots of them. And there was a beggar with a flaming red beard and eyes and we rushed to get money from our nannies to put in his bag, and tiptoed, terrified, up to him. But Paul, who was the youngest of us, tottered up and took all the money and put it in his pocket, and I thought it terrifically funny, this amazing feat. When I got home, I told my mother, and she said it was wrong. But then when my aunt Anna bought a farmhouse with her friend Dorothy Bullingham at Hocherthod, the vendor was a beggar from the streets of Vienna, a prosperous beggar with considerable property. She was told Paul Hamburg was to become in London Paul Hamlin Publishers and a philanthropist. After lunch, the boys were sent to their room for rest, and when the blinds were drawn, Lucian would say, "Have I gone blind?" knowing he had got a reaction after Stephen, who couldn't see the joke, ever. Let me stop here.